the mountain of the Lord, to the house of the God of Jacob, that he may teach us his ways, and that we may walk in his path. For out of Zion shall go forth the law, and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem.
All right, well, looking forward to this morning's time in the Word together, and we have a short passage, so I should be able to hopefully get through it if all things being equal. And I hate in some ways to break up chapter 3 because it more or less flows as a narrative, but there's some things I want to just point out in these first 6 verses that are of interest, so we want to take some time to spend together looking at that. All right. So if you have the handout and you can follow as I read, this is my own translation just to bring out certain things from the text. So we'll look at these first 6 verses. Then I'd like to do what we've been doing and just give an opportunity for you all to participate and with observations that you see going on in the text and what you think maybe the author or narrator is trying to communicate to us. And then we'll go through and look in a little more detail at each verse. Okay, so you can follow along as I read. Naomi, her mother-in-law, said to her, "My daughter, shall I not seek for you a resting place so that it may go well for you? Now isn't Boaz, whose young women you were with, our relative? Look, he is winnowing barley at the threshing floor tonight. Wash up, anoint yourself, put on your cloak, and go down to the threshing floor. Don't be known to the man until he has finished eating and drinking. Now when he lies down, take note of the spot where he lies. Go in and uncover his feet. Lie down, and he will tell you what to do." She replied to her, "I will do whatever you say." So she went down to the threshing floor and did everything her mother-in-law had commanded her. All right, so we see here, chapter 3 begins with Naomi taking the initiative and hatching a plan for Ruth to take the next step with Boaz. So there's a lot of interesting things going on here, and I don't know if you've ever heard a message preached from this passage or studied it in depth, but there's some interesting terminology here that I want to suggest for the original audience may have suggested that something illicit perhaps was going to take place. Okay, so we'll talk about that in a moment, but I want to just begin by looking at observation. So as you think about Naomi's plan here, one of the interpretive challenges is this a good plan or not so good plan? Is her ultimate intention noble or good? And what about the steps in which she's telling Ruth to approach Boaz? I'd be interested to hear your thoughts about that. So any observations that you notice in these first 6 verses that you'd like to point out as far as what's going on? Anyone? Patty?
Is that any kind of tradition? Did other people do that? Go and sleep at the feet of somebody you wanted to get them?
Not that I know of. In fact, ancient Near Eastern writings say that this was a frequent place that prostitutes would come because the men would sleep in the threshing area to guard the crop because, during the night they would be threshing because the winds were better. And also they wanted to make sure that thieves wouldn't come in and steal the crop because your livelihood depended on getting this properly stored and handled. And so it was frequent in that culture for women to come and approach the men there and offer their services for payment in that time and place. So that gives a hint that the story has maybe an ominous tone to it as far as what she's about to do. All right, any other observations? Crystal?
From what I've read in the Old Testament, Naomi is the one who actually has a right to request being redeemed. And from what I can gather the ages, she would have been a contemporary of Boaz, as far as the ages would have been about correct and everything. And so I think this is a very gracious thing that she's doing, because up until now, we always see Ruth being the one taking care of Naomi. And we actually see Naomi taking an action on Ruth's part for something that she actually could have gone and requested after they got back there, after they went back to them.
Right. Okay, yeah, so Naomi here is taking the initiative, and she's showing grace to Ruth. And in fact, she uses a word here in her speech in verse 1. She says, "My daughter, should I not seek a resting place for you?" And you notice in chapter 1, verses 8 and 9, she had also used that same word where she said, "May you go back and find rest in the house of your husband." So here, she's taking the next step to make sure that this happens for Ruth, to find rest in the house of her husband. So she's taking the initiative here in that sense. All right, good. I know there was another hand, Dwayne.
The fact that Boaz would be out there in the night at the threshing floor, just thinking from the sermon this morning, of the hard-working farmer, the earnest laborer.
Right.
This is the man who is senior, a leader, well-to-do, and he is out there personally overseeing, supervising, yes, not wanting the grain to go be stolen,
Right.
but also providing leadership to his teams and overseeing the flock and taking care of what is going on. And Naomi recognizes this.
Right.
So clearly she's already got an idea. This is the man who is a man of integrity. And this is the kinsman redeemer who is worthy.
Right. Yeah, and I think what we're seeing is we're realizing Boaz is a good match for Ruth, right? Because Ruth is a diligent hard worker. She exhibited that when she went and she gleaned 30 pounds of barley, as we saw last time. And now Boaz is also exemplary in his diligence, his hard work. And he's a good leader. You can tell that his subordinates enjoy working for him. They seem to enjoy when he comes to the field and greets them. So he is a model of a good leader and a hard worker and all those things. So certainly exemplary. That's a good observation. Anyone else? Yeah, Grace.
It doesn't seem that Naomi, just knowing kind of the character we've seen so far, that she would have sent Ruth there to prostitute herself. But because the actions that she does, what she does seems strange, to me it shows that Naomi must have, I would think, really had faith in Boaz's character.
Right.
I mean, because she's not going to send Ruth to go lay at the feet of just anybody in the night, because that could have completely destroyed her reputation. She could have ended up raped. I mean, who knows?
Right.
She had a lot of faith in the character of this man and that he would treat Ruth. I mean, as she says, do what he tells you to do. That he would do right by Ruth, which was pretty new.
Right. Right, so remembering this takes place during the time of the judges, so that's a foil for what we might expect to happen here, particularly when we look at the last part of Judges where women are taken advantage of and raped and brutalized and all those things. And here, she's sort of inserting Ruth in a potentially threatening situation, except that she has confidence in Boaz's character. And as some point out, her plan, we may land that it's ill-conceived or not, but the chances are greater, I would say, that it would go awry than it would actually work out. If you think about all the tangibles, Boaz waking up in the middle of the night to find someone at his feet, there's probably a greater likelihood he would immediately send her away thinking she was a prostitute or thinking something ill of her, but he proves himself to be exemplary, and so her faith works out. Obviously, God is providentially ordaining the details, but it's an interesting plan, and it actually works out, so the Lord was gracious in that way. All right, any other thoughts?
I was thinking that Naomi has already seen how Boaz has acted and treated Ruth all along, and his kindness to her, and I think she could just tell that his heart was kind of turned to her towards Ruth. But maybe he needed a little push.
Yeah. Let me talk about that, perhaps. He does. There are, my marker's running out, I hope you can still see them, but if you take the timeline of what's happened, when Ruth and Naomi come into town, it says it's the beginning of barley season, so that would be late March, early April. And by this point, when you're winnowing grain, it's late May, early June. So it's been about 2 months that have gone by. So after the original encounter where Boaz and Ruth meet in the field, it's uncertain how much time has elapsed, but probably several weeks. So at this point, is Boaz just not taking that next step is the question. We don't really know. One possibility that we'll talk about here is that Ruth is still wearing her widow's garb. if you will. And so when Naomi says to wash and anoint yourself and put on your mantle, what she's actually saying is take off your black dress and veil, if you will, and put on different clothes to signal that your period of mourning is over. Now, if that's the case, then Boaz may have just been a gracious gentleman not thinking to approach her during her time of mourning and waiting till that had passed. So that's one possibility. Another is just he's a busy guy and just hasn't thought absent-mindedly as men sometimes are. Not very often, but sometimes. Often. He hasn't actually taken the next step, and so that may also be the case. So,
Was he also older?
yes, yes.
So he may have got the age difference?
Right, so that's also a good possibility. And then Ruth is in an awkward position because she can't really approach him as a social superior without somewhat scandalizing them. So they're in this situation where it's almost like a Jane Austen novel where they can't quite come together until other people intervene, and so that has to happen. So Naomi comes up with a plan to do so. So, all right, doing.
With that said, foreshadowing Christ in our relationship with him, here we see we can approach him even though he is God.
Right.
And that experience being so amazing,
Mhm.
there's a lot of context there that's strikingly noteworthy in that sense that, and though he has to reach out to us for it to be right,
Yeah.
it also requires our responsiveness that we then see from Ruth
Right.
moving forward.
Yeah, and I agree. Without kind of sliding into allegory, we can, I think, see legitimate typology in the sense that Boaz is kind of a Christological figure in a certain sense. And Ruth, as a Gentile woman, I think prefigures, perhaps, hints at Gentile inclusion that the prophets more fully develop. And so there is a sense in which coming under the wings of Boaz is a beautiful picture of what God will in time do with the church and bringing them under the wings, as Malachi says, he's risen with healing in his wings, under the wings of Christ. And so it is an interesting word picture in that sense. All right, Janelle.
In our culture, we're used to people being married within 2 to 5 years of each other's ages.
Right.
as a general rule. But when we have Mary and Joseph, we are introduced to the concept of, the bridegroom goes, has his job, he prepares, gets his dwelling ready, and then he comes for the bride. So which is more applicable to this time period? Are they used to having a wider variation of ages between the couples? And so she's really not out of the market.
Right. Yeah, that's a good question. I think we see a span in this time where there could be older men marrying younger women or people of similar ages. So it just depends on the situation. So it's not out of bounds of normal behavior for an older man to take a younger wife, but maybe it isn't what they would have anticipated to be happening, at least initially. Probably the norm would be more the younger, closer in age. Usually the man is a little bit older, even though, say, he's already somewhat established, maybe in his early 20s, and then the wife would often be, say, 15, 16, 14. So that's generally how it went. So, yep. So that's good. Michael, you had a thought too?
Well, you had a lot of positive statements this morning. I'd weigh in on the other side.
Great.
Ruth is a Moabitess, correct?
Right.
And I know I don't have to bring this to your attention, but the Moabites were really not welcome within the camp.
Right.
So for her to jump this bridge, what are your thoughts there as to how this accommodated their thinking based on some stuff that took place in Deuteronomy?
Right. Well, I would say that as a Moabitess, the original reader is anticipating something perhaps illicit or bad as part of the background and baggage of this encounter. Because, number one, as we'll talk about, you have echoes of Lot's daughters and how they seduce their own father, and that's how the Moabites come to be. So the Moabites' existence comes through that illicit union. Then, which I don't have listed here, you have Numbers 25, which is the Baal Peor incident, and this is where Balaam is not able to prophesy a curse, so he comes up with plan B to seduce the Israelite men with the Moabitess women. And then you'll remember Phinehas is zealous for the Lord, takes a spear, thrusts it through the offenders, and so in that sense he stops the judgment of the Lord. But that's what Moabitess women would have conjured up to the normal Israelite probably reading
So
this.
not completely off base.
No, not at all. So I think all of that is an important foil for what we'll see take place, which is to say Ruth behaves in an exemplary way, as does Boaz. But the expectation is this is perhaps an ominous event, and there are numerous hints within the story itself of what I would call sexually charged language, which also hints at this. And, we don't often talk about this because Ruth is a great Sunday school story for flannel graph and little kids and all that sort of thing. But if you're reading this, I'll say, and Paul Wright, we read through this in Hebrew last year, you can tell there are numerous things in this story that give the connotation that perhaps something illicit is going to happen. The word uncover is used, and that's usually used for uncovering someone's nakedness, which is a euphemism in Leviticus 18 for having illicit intercourse. The feet are a euphemism for genitalia in a number of instances. So if you were what we would call using the restroom, you cover your feet. And to uncover the feet is also a euphemism for revealing someone's nakedness. And then the word shakav, to lie down, is used 8 times in this chapter. And with the exclusion of 2 other places, whenever that is used, it's for illicit sexual encounters. So all that to say, all these words cumulatively suggest maybe something strange, illicit is going to happen. So the expectation is heightened. How will this play out? What's going on? Is this good or bad? And so we're kind of drawn into the story that way. Pam?
Does Redeemer always mean marriage?
No, not necessarily. Some say that Naomi isn't necessarily thinking about land redemption. She just wants a marriage for Ruth. Others are thinking more redemption is in view and not even the marriage. I don't know. As I read this, I tend to see her as wanting a marriage for Ruth so that she can find a place to reach stability and happiness. But I don't know if she's thinking through all the implications about the family line. Because later Boaz will come in and he's the one who says, I want to raise up a line for the deceased to perpetuate their name in Israel. So, all right, Janelle. Yep.
Okay, so if Naomi's actually gambling, and if Boaz actually did have relations with Ruth, and it's all illicit, then what is the aftermath for the 2 women?
Well, that's a good question. She's gambling. So she's thinking, I think she trusts in Boaz's character enough. But if Boaz weren't the man that he is, then this creates a precarious situation where it could go badly. One of the stories that is echoed here is the story of Judah and Tamar, which is another example we'll see, where in that case, there's one encounter, she conceives, has twins, but it doesn't indicate in the text that they really had any contact or relations after that, if I'm remembering correctly, so that she has one encounter, whereas in this situation, he marries her, and it's a stable family life going forward, and they have Obed and so forth, so a little bit different in that sense. But it certainly could create a dangerous, risky situation. So.
Well, when Ruth has had all these months and time there, and she's redeemed her name, redeemed her lineage in a sense, and the people in the town are talking well of them, all it would have taken was one workman to be in the threshing floor and just say a different version.
Right. That's why when I read the plan, I wonder the wisdom of it imparts. But the narrator doesn't really say, should we think poorly of Naomi? Is this a bad plan? But there are elements of it that seem to suggest this could go awry. Like, this is certainly a dangerous situation where the wrong thing could be interpreted based on the events going on. I do wonder. I don't know if Naomi thought this was the only way she could get Ruth to interact with Boaz, but it certainly had a lot of dangerous elements to it. So, all right. Yeah, I know. Carlos, and then I'll go to Sam. Carlos.
I just also find it impressive that Ruth trusts Naomi. I'll do whatever you say. Here she is. She knows she's a Moabite. She knows the reputation of her people. She knows that history. And she's going to go somewhere where she knows things can go wrong. But we've seen in this story from the very beginning how God is really showing up, how he's really leading. And she has this trust in Naomi. It's all going to work out well. Boaz must have really been known as a guy, an upright, stand-up kind of guy, to take this bigger risk. So I find that Ruth knows who she is, and yet trusts it's all going to work out pretty well. And
Right.
It's an example of what we should be doing. We know who we are,
Right.
and we know what we should and shouldn't do, and it's all about trusting that God's going to see us through.
Right. Right. So Naomi, she does that, and her speech is 55 words, and Ruth's is 4 in response in Hebrew. So Ruth very much, whereas in chapter 2, she's taking the initiative. I'm going to go out and get grain to provide for us. The roles reverse here, where Naomi is taking the initiative, and so she has a lengthy speech, and Ruth replies in 4 words, essentially, I'll do whatever you say. And so she shows a willingness, not only hard work, but a willingness to submit to Naomi's
To what she
idea.
had said earlier.
Right.
I'll do whatever you want, go wherever you go.
Right.
And if I don't, may God curse me.
Right.
She's following up. She's actually saying, I'm gonna do this. Okay, I'm gonna trust you.
Right. Yep. Good. Sam, you had a thought?
Well, my question was that exactly. Where does her confidence come from? Is it confidence in Naomi? Is it confidence in Boaz's character? Or is she just kind of ignorant of all these undertones we've already talked about strength?
As far as Ruth goes?
Yeah.
I think she's just willing to submit to her mother-in-law as seeing what is best. And so in this culture, respect to elders was a very important thing. And so Ruth seems to have put herself under Naomi's protective umbrella. So in chapter 1, the word used there is she clings to Naomi. Cleaves is the word. So the idea is she's put herself, she's joined to Naomi to such an extent she's now part of Naomi's family. And so she's like the obedient daughter who will just follow whatever Naomi says. It doesn't tell us what Ruth is thinking. I would love to get more details. If she realizes that this is a risky plan, if she understands the full baggage culturally that she brings as a Moabitess who are known for immoral and illicit relationships with Israelites. So all of these things culturally are a huge load of baggage, but she still goes through with it, and the Lord mercifully brings it all into a good result. But certainly there's a tone there that makes one wonder how this will play out. All right, good. Any other thoughts? I don't know if I saw other hands. Yes, Beth.
I was thinking the same thing as Carlos, looking at Ruth and her willingness to do what Naomi said, regardless of what the consequences could be. I was also thinking, Naomi is kind of not necessarily usurping, but maybe usurping God's authority, that if God had intended for Ruth to marry Boaz, then wouldn't God bring it about? But Naomi takes the control
Right.
to create a situation to help that happen. And how many times in the past did husbands or wives do that and the results were calamity?
Right.
And in this situation, the results are a blessing.
Right. Yeah.
Find that interesting.
Yeah, that's a good observation. I think what we don't know is everything Naomi is thinking or everything Ruth is thinking. We have their speech, and how Hebrew narrative reveals characters often through the words that they say. But in this case, we don't really know, is Naomi still the seemingly bitter woman she was in chapter 1? Is she becoming the more joyful woman she seems to become in the last chapter, or is she transitioning somewhere on the scale between? So in other words, is she still trying to manipulate the results? When she came back, she said, call me Mara, I've been embittered by the Lord, and she seems to be angry at what's happened. So is she taking initiative in the flesh, so to speak, to try to bring about a positive result? Or is she thinking, this is how the Lord's going to answer my prayer in chapter 1? I'd love to get more detail about what she was thinking, and unfortunately we don't have that, but we at least see she's setting something in motion. In Genesis, it often turns out badly when they're taking the initiative in God's place and saying, well, God's not doing anything, so I need to take action. But here the Lord mercifully is turning around events for Naomi.
I also don't know if God was using her. Because there's
Right.
nothing said about what prompted that.
Right.
So on the flip side, maybe God had impressed that on her heart. That's what I want you to do. That's what I want to do to not have you embittered, to
Right.
make it better. This is my will. Do this.
Right. Yep, that's certainly true. Because exactly, by the end of the book, she's been transformed, I would say, into finding joy and fulfillment in what God has done. And so what we've talked about already is God answers every prayer that's uttered in the book, and he uses human agents to do that. So even here, we don't know, it's this mysterious synergy, if you will, between the human and the divine. God is doing it, but the human agent is also doing it, and somehow God's using it to bring about his purposes. So it's a pretty amazing thing. Dwayne.
There's a change. I think we're seeing that change for her from earlier chapters. Woe is me, woe is everything, okay, my daughters-in-law, go back to your families, I'm just going to go and, yes, I'm going to go be Jonah-esque, I'm going to go be,
Right.
woe is me. Versus now, okay, wait a second, I still have responsibility. I am a matriarch, mother-in-law, or mother to provide for my progeny, for my daughter-in-law, who's come back with it, who's been faithful. Oh, let me think outside myself. I'm getting over my own grief. I'm getting over, thinking again from 2 Timothy, I'm getting over the fact that I'm in prison right now because God's word is not going to be blocked. Shall I not now find a way to provide rest, security for you? Hey, and let's look at the way God has structured things with kinsmen redeemers. Oh, he's right here. It's been provided. Instead of just figuring out, okay, just go back to your heathen families, let's get you into the house of God. So it seems that there's at least been some transition.
Right. Yeah, and we might say that the length of her speech indicates that, because usually whoever has the longest speech is highlighted as the main character in a given context. And so in this sense, she seems to be very methodical in what she's instructing Ruth to do. So perhaps this indicates she has a renewed resolve that this will work out and that God will bring all this together.
Does that match up with the whole book? Ruth's speeches, total words that are spoken by Ruth compared to Naomi and Boaz would seem to be much, much smaller.
It is. It is. I don't remember the statistical breakdown, but as I recall, I think Naomi has the most, and then Boaz, and then Ruth. So, yep. All right, these are good observations.
I was going to say one thing, that it's interesting that somebody's prior relationship with you often can dictate how you hear them when they give you such advice. Have they been a manipulator? Have they been a controller? Or have they invested in your life and earned your respect? I know there are dozens, if not hundreds of people to whom Pastor Daniel has often said, here's where you need to go next. Here's what I see for you to do next. This is the school that I highly encourage you to consider. And these men and these women would say, that was God speaking through him to my life. But he had earned a prior platform to do that.
Right.
And they knew who he was, and there was a trust and deep relationship and respect. And from that platform, God was able to speak through him into their life.
Right. And it's undergirded here in the book, and we see this by chesed, this Hebrew word for loving kindness, loyal love, steadfast love. So Naomi's exhibiting that to Ruth, and it's a good example for us as well. If we're investing that in other people, then we'll have a basis for speaking into their life and that trust factor that's so important. All right, good. Any other? Okay, well, let me say a few things here. Let's see if I can get my notes up. All right, if you have your hand out there, I just want to point out what's really interesting is how the narrator has constructed these two chapters, Ruth 2 and Ruth 3. In both instances, the chapters begin with a domestic conversation between Naomi and Ruth. In chapter 2, Ruth takes the initiative. She's going out to get grain. In chapter 3, Naomi takes the initiative. She's going to find a resting place, a husband for Ruth. In the middle of both chapters is this lengthy episode in which Ruth meets Boaz in some encounter. In chapter 2, it's in the fields working. Some would say, chapter 2 is at work, chapter 3 is at play. I don't know if that's a good way to say it, maybe work and sleep. But either way, in the one, Boaz is working. In the hinge, the transition is the middle of the day, right? At mealtime, Boaz invites Ruth to come into his intimate circle to have a meal. Dip your bread in the vinegar. Come up and eat with us. In chapter 3, it hinges at the middle of the night, is literally the Hebrew phrase, at the middle of the night, he wakes up, and there she is. And we'll talk about this next week, but I love how it's phrased. Middle of the night, he looks, and behold, a woman at his feet. Like, whoa, what is she doing here? So in the middle of the night, he wakes up, and Ruth has again approached Boaz, but this time, rather than Boaz inviting Ruth in, Ruth has approached Boaz in order to ask for protection, if you will, under his wings, ultimately a marriage scenario. And then both chapters end with Ruth and Naomi back in their excited conversation back at home and seeing what will happen. All right, so there's deliberate structuring here that is interesting in both chapters. Now, one of the fascinating things that I find about this, and another reason why I love how this narrative is put together, is there are, it would seem, distinct echoes in this story that reflect earlier episodes from the book of Genesis. And I think the narrator is consciously designing it this way. And you have a chart there that I put together to sort of outline this. So if you look at those two examples, we have one situation would be Lot's daughters in Genesis 19. And maybe if we had a little bit more time, we could turn there and look. But if you look at from verse 30 to the end of the chapter, remember this story. It's after Sodom and Gomorrah have been destroyed, right? And they flee. And the two daughters say, there's no man left on the face of the earth. So we're destitute. And they're in this cave. And so the elder comes up with this plan. Let's get our father drunk tonight. I'll go into him and have relations with him. And then the next night you can do it. And that's in fact what happens. And so Lot is seemingly unaware of what's going on. And this occurs. And the narrator tells us there in Genesis that this is how the Moabites and the Ammonites come to be, through these unions with the daughters of Lot and Lot. So you notice there on the chart how there are some similarities to this story. Number one, women conspire in a clandestine plan to continue the family line while the lone man involved is unsuspecting of the plan. We don't know if Boaz, he seems to be interested, I think, as I read chapter 2, that he's at least noticed Ruth and he's interested. It's quite possible that because she's wearing the widow's garb, he's thinking it's improper for me to approach her or do anything beyond allowing her the necessary time. But in any event, he doesn't seem to suspect that this is going to happen right now when it does in chapter 3. So he's surprised. And that's the same way with Lot. In both, point 2 there, drinking and darkness set the backdrop. So chapter 3, Boaz eats and drinks. Now what's the difference? When Boaz wakes up, he's fairly coherent. More coherent than I would be in the middle of the night if I woke up and tried to have a conversation. But he seems to be able to do that. So he wakes up, and whatever he's eaten and drunk, he's still of his mind and he's sensible. And so when he wakes up, he's able to carry on a conversation. However, with Lot and his daughters, it's not the case. There, the Hebrew word for lie down, which connotes illicit sexual relations, is used 7 times. And here in chapter 3, it's used 8 times. Now, I'm not suggesting that Boaz and Ruth do consummate a relationship on the threshing floor. Now, you may be surprised to find out that there are a number of commentators that do say that happened, that they actually did have relations, because the uncovering of the feet suggests that she has perhaps uncovered him in a rousing sort of way. But I would say, based on the story, it seems that there are hints in order to show that the opposite actually happens. In other words, it's an atmosphere that we may say is sexually charged, but both characters have complete integrity, and they show self-restraint, and they wait, and they show grace and kindness to each other. So I think all of that to say it's a build-up for a noble outcome in which Boaz is the gentleman who acts with self-restraint. All right, and then both have activities taking place outside the city, away from other observers, and both obscure the identity of the women when they come and when they go. The second story that has echoes here is the story of Tamar. You remember Tamar in Genesis 38. We've already drawn some connections there in terms of royal imagery in Ruth and in the Tamar story, but there are other likenesses as well. Tamar is a widow without an heir, so she's waiting, and she waits a long time, as the story tells, until she realizes she won't be given in marriage. And then she has two previous husbands who have a name that is a possible wordplay. So could possibly mean wicked, and Onan, sorrow or trouble. You'll notice that that compares to Ruth, who's married to Mahlon, that means weak or sickly. Then Tamar takes the initiative to meet the man. She uses the allurement of female sexuality to her advantage. There may be hints that Ruth at least is also making herself to look attractive, not necessarily in order to seduce Boaz, but just so that he realizes that she's available, if we could say it that way. So she goes through this process. Now, some say that this is what a bride would do to prepare for the wedding day, to wash, anoint. You think about, they don't have deodorant in those days, and it's a pretty hot climate. So you would wash and you would anoint yourself, that is, use lotions and scented perfumes, and then put on certain clothes. Now, I think the NIV translation has Naomi telling Ruth to put on her best clothes. It's really not a very good translation. It simply means to put on her mantle. And the mantle, this is a key distinction for whether this is an illicit type thing or not. The mantle is simply a cloak that often a person would use as a covering at night when it gets cold. So it seems that Naomi is simply telling Ruth, take along your cloak, it will be cold, use it to disguise yourself, but it's not for illicit purposes, it's simply to warm yourself. You're not necessarily dressing up as a prostitute, I guess is what some would think is going on. I don't think that's the case. All right, and then Ruth does cover herself with a mantle versus Tamar with the veil, as I said. But then you'll notice the third column on the right, there are contrasts here that show, in spite of that background, we see a turn of events here. Ruth identifies herself and explains her request. So she's different from the other women. She has character because she is clear about who she is and what she's requesting. Boaz restrains himself, doesn't take advantage of the opportunity to have sexual relations, unlike Judah and Lot, who both show that they don't have the self-control. At least in Lot's case, he's probably unaware to an extent. But in both cases, the relationship is consummated. Here, that does not appear to be the case. And then godly marriage and sexual intimacy follow the event, producing a stable family, whereas it's a one-time encounter by all appearances with Lot's daughters and with Tamar. And then lastly, the characters display integrity and restraint, and they provide an honorable legacy. All right, so it's an interesting story that gives us an insight into how Naomi is thinking to provide a final fulfilling marriage union for Ruth as she goes through. All right, so our time is basically gone, so I'll just wrap this up with a few thoughts. Naomi has shown kindness. You notice she starts by saying, my daughter, to Ruth. This is the same phrase that Boaz uses in chapter 2 to address her. And so the author is very skillful in drawing these literary connections. So she comes up with this plan. She says to wash yourself, anoint yourself, put on your cloak, go down to the threshing floor. The threshing floor was usually on a hill outside the city. The reason she says go down is because the cities are usually located on hills. You have to walk down and then walk back up. They would situate them on hills because that's where the breezes were best, and they would, if you know how it worked, you throw up the grain and the chaff gets blown away and the kernels fall, and that's one way that they would winnow the grain. So at any rate, this was a common custom to stay at the threshing floor for the men, and so this is what Boaz does. Now these instructions, we don't have time to look there, but you can just make a note of 2 Samuel 12:20. 2 Samuel 12:20. David, when he is over with his mourning period, after his son has died, his son that was conceived by Bathsheba, during his affair with her, he mourned, and then after the child died, this exact same sequence is outlined there, that he washes himself, he anoints himself, he puts on his cloak, and he worships, is the sequence there. So I think there's probably a connection here that what Naomi is saying is, take off your widow's mourning garb and put on your regular everyday clothes, wash yourself, anoint yourself. The mourning period is over. It's time now to move to the next stage of our lives. And so part of that will be approaching Boaz. And so that seems to make sense. I think that's probably what's going on. All right, so she comes in. She tells her to go in, wait till he lies down, mark the spot, and go in. Some of this, it's uncertain why she instructs this way, other than probably she doesn't want anybody seeing Ruth and thinking something of her that isn't true, because, as I said, it was common for prostitutes to come to the threshing floor. So she's to not be known to the man. Again, that's a word that can mean sexual intimacy, to know someone. Adam knew his wife, so she says literally, don't be known to the man. But she's to disguise herself and then go and uncover his feet. Now, why uncover his feet? I'll tell you why. I have no idea. Other than perhaps because they're in the threshing floor, the breeze will cause him to wake up. That's one idea. It's not sure exactly why she does this, other than perhaps it's a metaphorical way of saying to cover her with his garment, which is a metaphor for his protection, his provision. And so earlier it was prayed and that God would provide a way for her to be provided for by a husband, and Boaz is going to fulfill that prayer. And then later on, it'll say that the Lord has done this, has covered with his wings, if you will. So Boaz does this, and she's going to ask for that to happen. All right, and so Ruth, very compliant, she obeys, and she says, I will do whatever you say. And she goes down and does what her mother-in-law commands her, and we'll pick up here next time, next Sunday, Lord willing, and we'll continue and see how the plan unfolds. As far as an application goes, I think one application we can make is that even though they were in a situation that was charged with potential sexual attraction that could have ended illicitly, both characters show godly behavior. So I think that's a good application for our culture, right? We live in a culture that is, by all accounts, very sexually charged. It's hard to get on the internet without being bombarded by messages that would tell us that we need to give in to the lusts of the flesh. So Boaz and Ruth are an example for us of how to act godly, even in a situation that could have been easy to fall prey to temptation. They showed godly character, and so I think that's a good application that we also need to put into practice. All right, well, thank you for your good observation. I know I kept you a few minutes over. Let's close in a word of prayer, and we'll be dismissed. Father, we thank you for your word, and we know that even in looking at 6 verses this morning, that it is powerful to sanctify us and to encourage us, and I pray that would be the case. I ask that you'd help us to grow by the milk and meat of your word. I pray that as we think about Boaz and Ruth, that it would encourage us. We live in a day that is quite a bit like the days of the Judges, and we see a lot of moral chaos around us. So help us to be Boazes and Ruths in our daily lives, that we would exemplify godly character, that we would be more Christ-like in our relationships, and I pray that we might exhibit the same sort of perseverance and godly character that they exemplified in a way that would leave an honorable legacy for ourselves as we walk with you all the days of our lives. So we thank you for your kindness to us. We thank you for salvation in Christ. We thank you that he's the ultimate kinsman redeemer who loves us and gave his life for us. And so we are thankful today that we have that salvation, and we pray all this in the name of Christ our Savior. Amen.